Welcome to CMM Off the Page, a podcast brought to you by CMM Magazine, a brand of Care Choices Limited. Guest speakers will equip listeners with take-home advice to support best practice in the social care sector. The podcast is available to listen to on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and to watch on the CMM website. We hope you enjoy this latest episode.
Care Choices is a multimedia publisher, event organiser and podcast producer. Care Choices works alongside industry governing bodies, local authorities and care providers to publish impartial information for individuals and their families or carers, from paying for care to assistive technology and legal matters. With 30 years publishing experience, the largest portfolio of care and support directories in the UK and over 2 million page views annually, Care Choices is the perfect route for care providers to reach people actively seeking care and support. Contact Care Choices to discuss how we can help promote your business both online and in print. Give us a call on 01 223 207 770. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of CMM Off the Page, where we're starting things a little differently than usual. My name is Henry Thornton, lead editor at CMM, and it's a pleasure to be joined by Vic Rayner, Chief Executive Officer at the National Care Forum, to discuss what the outcome of the general election means for social care. Welcome, Vic.
Thank you, Henry.
Now, I should explain that we have already recorded this episode and we're preparing to go live when government announced its plans to withdraw the Adult Social Care Training and Development Fund and postpone the adult social care charging reforms indefinitely. Therefore, we thought we'd invite Vic back to touch upon these announcements and their implications for care providers and people drawing upon care and supports before getting into the original recording and hearing from our other expert guests. So, Vic, perhaps you could provide an overview of government's original objectives concerning these policies and what their withdrawal means for the sector. I know you're particularly keen to discuss the impact on the workforce.
Yes, of course. Yeah, no, I will do. Thank you, Henry. And I think it's important just to get this in context because, lots of the things that we were hoping might happen, may happen in a different way now. So the first thing, let's think about the charging reform, first of all. So people will probably remember that the charging reform or the introduction of a cap on care costs was actually part of the original Care Act. It was Part B of the Care Act that came in 2014. The second part of it was already due to be implemented a year after the first one, so it's going to be in 2015. It was then delayed again and went off the table essentially, but was brought back in as part of the reform programme with a different funding level attached to the cap. Was due to come in 23, I think, October 23. That was pushed again after the mini budget to October 25. And as we understood it, and in the build up to the election, questions were asked about specifically whether the cap would continue to be introduced, and assurances were given that it would. When Rachel Reeves made her announcement about the £22 billion black hole, that was her first reference to social care, was to say that that cap on costs was being, as you say, postponed indefinitely. So that was badged as billing a saving to the sector, saving to the government of £1 billion. Obviously, it's a massive change to the way in which reform was intended to be implemented and has significant ramifications, I think, in the context of, what does that do to the overall prioritization of reform?
Regarding the withdrawal of the workforce and training fund, obviously workforce is one of the most pressing issues impacting the sector today. So its withdrawal is, many would consider to be 2 steps back on what was initially a quite a promising development when the policy was first introduced.
Yeah, so the workforce is, you're absolutely right, the most, probably for many people working within social care, the most pressing issue access to the workforce, levels of vacancies, turnover figures. You know, these are all things that we spend a lot of time focusing our energy and attention on. And the previous government had highlighted workforce as a major priority in the reform programme. Again, there had already been changes to how this was being implemented. So originally, when People at the Heart of Care was first announced, the white paper for the reform, there was over £500 million was intended to be allocated towards workforce reform. This was reduced significantly, so it's halved at some point during the reform programme, I think April 22. That was intended to be, that was reduced significantly. But there were a number of factors that were in play. You might also remember the National Audit Office put out a very critical report of the government in the context of how delayed its workforce reforms had already been. So when we'll move forward to the election, there weren't any specific commitments made by the Labour government in relation to the specifics of the training workforce programme that have been highlighted. But there are commitments obviously around training and development and pay terms and conditions for workforce. But again, not on the day of the announcement, but the next day, the new Care Minister put out a written statement. This was the last day of Parliament, actually, outlining that the workforce funding, the training and development funding, would be significantly cut back. The way it's been described is that it will be funded at the level of this year, but the previous intention had to been to put significantly more funding in. And that was encapsulated in a number of ways. So there was money that was going to be given for the new care certificate, the new qualification attached to the care certificate. So 37,000 people were intended to be trained with that. There was going to be additional money given for training and development, but although that figure was never specified, there is a National Audit Office figure which is puts the whole workforce reform training fund of at around 125 million. So some of that money for training has gone. There was money attached to the CPD for nurses within social care and for apprenticeships for social work and nursing apprenticeships. So those money, you know, those, we're not clear exactly what's happened to all of those factors, but what we do know is that the money has gone from this overarching 100 million plus figure down to what's badged as the equivalent of the previous year, so a much smaller proportion. Again, the figures have not been published, but we anticipate that will be under 20 million or around 20 million for the whole sector. They're very disappointing, I think, in the context of what everybody says is the most important thing, that training, development, workforce retention, these are all things we know play a major part. And to have that as the first two things that the government has done in relation to social care, I think has been felt quite hard by the sector.
So I thank you, Vic, for joining us, and hopefully that has provided some helpful context to support the original recording, which will follow shortly. Hello and welcome everyone to the latest episode of CMM Off the Page, a provider-led podcast discussing the most important topics impacting the adult social care sector today. I'm Henry Thornton, lead editor at CMM, and today I'll be taking us through proceedings as we discuss what the general election outcome means for adult social care. We'll be covering the first 100 days in office, picking apart manifesto pledges, understanding the role of local government, and recognising social care as integral to economic growth. Joining the conversation today is a selection of fantastic guests, all of whom are well equipped to provide expert insight and commentary for the benefit of care providers. So perhaps we could begin with some introductions, telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do, beginning with you, Vic, if that's okay, who is also my co-host for today's episode.
Brilliant. Thanks, Henry. So yeah, I'm Vic Rayner. I'm the Chief Exec of the National Care Forum, which is a membership body for not-for-profit care providers.
Thank you. Melanie?
Hello, so I'm Mel Williams. I'm a Director of Adult Social Care in Nottinghamshire, and for the next 9 months, I've already done 3 months now, I'm president of ADASS. ADASS is the membership association of all of the directors of adult services across 153 councils.
Thank you. Martin?
Yeah, hi, I'm Martin Vicks. I'm Chief Exec of an organisation called Belong. We're a care provider and we run 8 care villages, as we call them, in the Northwest. All of our villages comprise of residential care, independent living and community facilities that are also open to the public. And we're also a not-for-profit provider, should add as well.
Fantastic. And Isaac?
Hi everyone, so I'm Isaac. I'm someone that has drawn on adult social care for over 15 years plus. I'm passionate about the voice of people that draw on social care, and I'm also someone that self-directs my own support by managing a direct payment. It gives me a really good life, actually.
Fantastic. Thank you all for joining us today. I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules to discuss the topic of the general election outcome today. So let's get into it. The priorities for the first 100 days in office. So perhaps we could begin by discussing each of our guests' priorities for the first 100 days, beginning with yourself, Melanie.
Okay, so Henry, I don't think colleagues on the call will differ from this. One of the burning platforms we have is our workforce, and having workforce that feel valued, rewarded, recognised, well-trained, and we have enough people to support the people that want to live a good life in the community. So that's one of the key priorities. So probably colleagues will have seen that we launched a workforce strategy as a sector this week. So the government's really lucky actually, because what it has ready made for them is a bit of a blueprint as to how to do that and describes the sorts of elements that's needed. So I think it's going to be really straightforward for government to pick that up. And this is a burning platform issue. So the reason it's a 100-day issue rather than a longer term reform and can wait for some of the Royal Commission to play out is because of the position we've got with international recruitment being cut off. So across the country, and I'm sure colleagues will sort of reflect some of that. So Nottinghamshire, for example, we've been really fortunate to have really great workforce recruitment and retention, but we've heavily relied on international recruitment, both as a council and as a sector, and that it accounts for about 4% of our workforce. And we have 31,000 people in Nottinghamshire, for example. So we really need to be thinking about how do we retain who we've got, given the pay is quite low for many of the women that work in adult social care. And we need to sort of tackle some of that wellbeing and recruitment issue. So that's one of the things I'd like to pitch for. And probably, I mean, I'll talk about charging reform and some of the short-term funding in a moment, but I wonder, Henry, whether colleagues want to just touch on workforce.
Absolutely. And I think that tees you up nicely, Vic.
Yeah, I mean, I think workforce is absolutely critical. And I think what's interesting is you mentioned, we might be all anxious to talk about the sort of wider reform agenda. And I actually think that, whilst there hasn't been the sort of announcements people might have wanted around wider reform just yet, actually, if we look at how we tackle workforce and we look at how we might have to rethink, potentially, with a fair pay agreement or any of those kind of approaches, in essence, what we will be doing is talking about what we want a future care sector to look like, because actually the way that we pay people and we reward people and we employ people is very dependent on the way in which we run the sector as a whole. So there'll be things that we would want to look at in that context around how services are commissioned and how that enables providers to fulfill any future requirements around pay terms and conditions. We'll want to look at the way in which services are structured and the way in which people can develop their skills and expertise in a sector which is full of very small organisations and makes it quite difficult to think about career pathways and things like that. So we'll have to, if we properly want to grasp the issue of developing a workforce, this enormous workforce of nearly 1.6 million people, if we want to look at that seriously, we have to we can look at it through the lens of workforce, but we shouldn't kid ourselves that it won't have an impact on the broader approaches to social care as a whole. So I'm really excited, as Mel says, we've got the workforce strategy. It gives a really good sense of the things that are important. What, of course, has been missing to date in that context is the kind of levers that we need government to bring to the table, which are around the pay, terms and conditions issues, and how they are going to be fulfilled, because it's in nobody's interest to talk the talk of a strategy and then not put the funding and commitments that sit behind it that, you know, very properly will enable us to reward the brilliant workforce that we have.
Absolutely. So certainly more to come, we hope, from central government. And Isaac, coming to you now, please, if you're able to discuss what your priorities for the first 100 days of government should look like for you.
Sure. So for me, the first 100 days is a really great opportunity for a new government to really centre the role of lived experience in trying to make some of their ambitions around adult social care and health a reality. I think new government, new opportunities to influence and really understand how we can work together to achieve the things that we've all spoken about, or people have spoken about today, focusing on like quality of experience, good care and support, the voice of many people rather than a few. You know, there's seldom heard people, easy to ignore people. Like, how do we really shift so the government is really working with people lived experience to not only bring their policies to a reality, but that is a long-term commitment.
Absolutely. And lastly, to bring in the a provider's view, Martin, from yourself.
Yeah, well, just first thing to say, hugely echo what Isaac just said about making sure that people with experience are involved. But yeah, I massively support the idea that workforce has to be the #1 priority, and I think it's probably a theme we're going to come back. But the only things I'd add to everything else that has already been said, which I would support, I think it's really interesting that and the Skills for Care workforce strategy does this really well, is that there should be a lens on the economic benefits of investing in the workforce in social care, because it's ultimately desperately needed. But there are economic benefits to that as well that I think you can estimate. So I think it's really important that both sides are looked at. And then I think the only other thing very much related to this is I'd ask the government to be thinking about the priorities of how they can support social care. So say investment and focus on the workforce. So I think there's something for the government to be getting their heads around in terms of what needs to come first, and it obviously with a finite pot of money to help support all of this as well.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Martin. Isaac, let's come to you.
Yeah, oh, thanks. So I think as a disabled person, as somebody that was really looking for a change, and the reason why I voted Labour was because there was such a need for change. And I think the work to be done is going to be hard, but we shouldn't stop dreaming, like having really big dreams around how we want social care to be. I think over the last 10 to 15 years, there has been lots of challenges that social care have faced. And I think going forward, if we can ensure that people are paid well, if we understand that people should have the right to self-determine how their support is provided, I think, you know, it's only going to lead to a fair and just society. I think Labour's been very good at kind of reaching out and demonstrating their willingness to connect with people like me, to really understand how do we want social care to be the best it possibly can be. And that really is important, because we felt as disabled people there was a lack of hope and a lack of vision. And I would encourage everybody to dream big, even knowing that in this first term they will probably be very limited in what they can achieve. This is a long-term solution that we need, not to come along and just promise, but actually do the work over time to ensure that we improve the lives of people. We have a really good offer for the workforce, and that we have the best social care internationally and nationally.
Absolutely, thank you. Melanie, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I wanted just to touch on Vic's point. So as well as an adult social care lens, which I think is really important, because we need to think about, you know, there's no care without housing, for example, is a really obvious thing. We also need to look at those reforms, the lens of disabled people and older adults. So that would be, you know, I think it's those three lenses, because I think if we did that, we'd achieve, you know, a great amount for adult social care as a sector. So if we thought about employing people, in the employment bill with protected characteristics, particularly working age adults with disability, and how employment is more neurodiverse friendly, more disabled friendly, I think there'd be a huge benefit back to adult social care when it comes to the sort of the responsibilities of local government. So it's just to sort of chip that into really Vic's point.
Yeah, absolutely. And Martin, perhaps you could pick up on Melanie's point about housing being an integral point.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, just before, I think just to say, yeah, the unpaid care sector as well, just to add to that list as well. But I was just going to also just come back on something that Isaac sort of started to say, and I think that it clearly needs to be a long-term plan, and to get a level of ambition into it needs that sort of scale, but it also needs to be a cross-party thing. And clearly, you know, that the government are in a position to try and facilitate that well compared to previous times. So I think that's really important as well. But yeah, housing, of course, is really important, and older people's housing hasn't had as much of a focus as it should have been. So I think obviously there's a big housing agenda, and I think it's really crucial that older people's housing and the variety of options that are needed for older people's housing, we're not just talking about residential care, are really a crucial part of Labour's plans in that as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Talking about the manifesto pledges, and specifically those made to the care sector, the headlines are a national care service and a home first care agenda to help to support people to live independently. I just wanted to go into these a bit further and think about what their potential impact would be, and what would need to be done to ensure these pledges are successful.
Yeah, well, first thing I'd say, and I think we're sort of, without trying to repeat something we sort of mentioned before, working in social care, the work that anyone who works in social care does, is hugely important, and it's skilled work, it's important work. So I think all of us on the panel would support that there needs to be more investment to help support better pay, better terms and conditions. So but to achieve that, I think obviously there is an element of how it's funded. So that's clearly a question. But yeah, we'd all support it. It's desperately needed, and I think there's also a status thing. So the idea of forming a national care service, I think, and obviously there's lots of detail that needs to come out about this, but one of the things that I like about it is it would provide an identity and a status for people that work in care that just doesn't exist at the moment outside of their own organisation. So clearly the funding related to how this works is really important. But go back, as something I said earlier on, I think there's a huge amount of the economic upsides in investing in it as well. And I say the Skills for Care report that I mentioned earlier on talks about that a lot. But I think what it doesn't cover, which I think perhaps there's an element of underestimating this as well, is it talks a lot about the economic impacts from the point of view of the people that receive care and support. But actually, there's a massive economic benefit of investing in people, the workforce themselves, you know, because as Vic alluded to, the sort of a lot of the care workforce, if we want to sort of level up the country, there's a way of investing in the workforce that very much helps with the economic benefits, the well-being benefits of that, the health benefits of the workforce as well. So yeah, it's hugely important, and how it's funded is something that needs to be considered quite carefully with a long-term view.
Fantastic. Isaac?
Yeah, we can get really fixated like what we call something, but actually as a disabled person, knowing that I can't move to particular places because I might not get the care and support I need, just means that I don't have the same life opportunities as people maybe on this call. So for me, it's irrelevant what you call it. It's about ensuring that we have the best possible care at a national level that makes sense to people, at a local level, individuals like me, their families, and actually we're not having a postcode lottery, which is often the case. We're not having places that are not providing the care that they want to provide because of the lack of funding or the lack of support from central government. So I think for me, it's the values that sit behind this, is that actually if we elevate care and we remember that care is something that enables us to live good lives, so then they just save my life, but actually social care gives me a good life. And if that's something that happens to everybody wherever they live, it's a win-win-win. And I think that we need to have some national conversations about how we do this, and ensure that we include people with lived experiences on providers, all sorts of people, because actually this has to test or stand a test of time. And, you know, we're thinking about, you know, what does this look like in the next 20 years? And I think it's a really positive that they're thinking about something so proactive.
Thank you. Thank you, Isaac. Melanie.
Yeah, just building on that, I think some of our strengths are also some of our weaknesses, not surprisingly. So I think what we do well in adult social care is to be giving individuals, you know, self-directed support and some control over their lives. And, you know, many areas, you know, support people through direct payments in the way that Isaac, you know, introduced himself and direct their own support. And it's really important that we maintain that. But equally, as Vic said, we have so much variation across the country. And we know that with the demographic change in the next 10 years, the places that are going to be really struggling are the coastal areas, and they won't have the workforce to be meeting the needs. So there's something that we need to tackle at a national level. So there's going to be that balancing act of thinking what the National Care Service means. So it's going to be quite, I suppose, an art to think about how do we keep local providers, local relationships, local integration with the NHS and with our housing authorities in what it sort of drives good care and support driven by people, you know, directing their own support, and have national standards and national initiatives that help sustain. So I think that's going to be a trick that we need to somehow play out. And you know, I do think of it in the same way as others. I think it was a set of standards and initiatives. I think the care covenant has been mentioned in a number of some of those national reports about an agreement. So like I said, there's quite a lot of detail to work through. I thought I'd just touch a little bit on the money. So Martin mentioned that. So ADASS undertakes a spring survey every year, and we launched our spring survey this week. And adult social care directors are predicting the biggest overspends in their budgets for the last 10 years, so in more than a decade. And we're seeing as nearly 900 million of savings being required from our budgets this year. And so I think in the first 100 days, and in thinking about the National Care Service, the issue of funding can't be ducked. And it has been, hasn't it? So we've got a number of short-term initiatives, so market sustainability funds, discharge funding, all trying to, you know, prop up the service and to focus on key areas, but they're all short-term and they're all due to be dropping out this year. So the funding really has to be front and centre, because that's a real issue. And so I think one of the other things that I'd want to see addressed is what does that mean for charging reform, and is that the biggest priority? So how would we do that? So the charging reform money was repurposed to fund inflation and adult social care, and most of us passed that money on to the markets. That's how because that's where the inflationary pressures were felt. So it doesn't sort of fund the increase in that capacity we need. So there's some reports about that this week. So we need to almost double our assessment workforce, for example. I mean, it's a brilliant thing. I think in Nottinghamshire, people are on the edges of that cap. And we certainly need to sort out the floor. So the minimum income guarantee and charging for working age adults, and the metering, and the fact that the link with Department of Work and pensions and benefits are all concerns that we need to meet. But there's a reality about what we're able to achieve. So some decisions on the short-term funding and some of that reform that's been delayed, I think is something we're going to need to tackle alongside how do we gather those issues up into, you know, a reform agenda that's really going to benefit people.
Absolutely. A bit of a gear change, but the issue of regulation in the sector is something that hasn't been covered, as far as I'm aware, in manifestos or in conversations since the election outcome was announced. But as we know, the regulator, the CQC, is undergoing the introduction of the single A assessment framework, and providers have had mixed experiences with its introduction, I think is fair to say. So is this the new government an opportunity for the CQC to address some of its urgent pressing issues in relation to the introduction of the framework? And could government intervene at any point, possibly?
Yes, there has been some definite difficulties with the implementation of single assessment framework. And I think, I mean, I suppose the point to reiterate is that everybody has a kind of commitment towards quality. So, you know, there is a collective and shared interest in getting regulation right. I think that there are a number of things that we, you know, think would make that better. And going forward, certainly there's much more work to be done, and I think it's been acknowledged by the CQC about explaining how the single assessment framework works, recognition of the number of things, you know, there's some catch up to be done in terms of the business as usual work around registration and around reinspection and those kind of things. And what's difficult, I think, is without getting those things addressed, there's a real problem around kind of credibility in that sense, and about you know, how providers can, and those in the public and those using care and support, can have confidence in that overall regulatory approach. Can government intervene? Well, of course, government can play a role if it chooses to. You're right, nobody really kind of focused on that, except in the context, as we said, about a national care service, that quality was absolutely part of a future framework. So I mean, I think we do, and we want to continue to work with the regulator to kind of get things right as quickly as possible, and to play our part in terms of communicating and supporting providers to understand the direction of travel and to focus on that. I think that there's lots of, we might want to look at other regulatory regimes where there's much more focus maybe on improvement and an opportunity to spread innovation. We're working in a very fast moving environment, and the regulator is often the only person at some level with an overview of innovation at pace or in real time. So it would be good to do that. And I think, this may not be, you know, universally popular, but I think that there is a real important factor about the sort of changes that were being made to the regulator's role to continue to cover local authorities and to cover local authority commissioning in that context, and to focus on ICBs, which they haven't yet started that programme, because actually if you're a care provider or if you're a person using care and support, and your ability to receive great care is impacted either by the way in which perhaps that service is commissioned or funded, or their ability to access wider health care on your behalf, then that's really important that the quality of the service is judged with an understanding of those factors in mind, and potentially that there is a clear pathway for the regulator to raise concerns about the overall system so that care gets better for everybody in that locality.
Thank you. Isaac.
So I think there's something really interesting about when the CQC comes visiting, and what kind of fear surrounds the CQC coming to providers or local authorities. And it always astonishes me, because I think that actually people want to provide the best possible care. The CQC's role shouldn't be one of like a punitive role. It's actually about learning and improvement. And I think there needs to be like a real narrative change or a shift to actually the CQC coming to support organisations to do their best, and embedding lived experience within that. I've been on a number of inspections where, you know, there's some really good examples of co-production. There are the making it real, the I and we statements that are embedded in kind of the CQC's process. I would say that, like anything, it takes time to kind of use these kind of ways of measuring and assessing quality, but you have to do it from a place of wanting to improve, not to tell off people. And I think sometimes, if I'm honest, lots of people run around trying to get all of their ducks in a row for an inspection. Actually, this is business as usual. You should be doing this every day. Yeah, I love the fact that obviously they're using the I and we statements. I love the fact that embedding lived experience in that. Could they do more? Yes. Do they need to be more about learning and improvement? Yes. And I think sometimes when, particularly at local level, given personal experience, when you see that CQC rating and it doesn't marry with your own experience, it can just make you feel like heartbroken. So there needs to be much more of a triangulation of like, how do you really make this make sense across this?
Thank you. And just to note that Isaac has left the call now, so we thank him for joining us as a guest today. Let's move on to something that we have spoken about already, but the importance of the new government recognising social care as being integral to economic growth. The Secretary of State has already discussed in his first major speech about the NHS and social care being engines of growth, to quote, and about giving opportunities in training and work to local people. So I think it's important that we discuss the benefits of investing in social care as a vital part of the country's wider economic agenda. Vic.
This is a very exciting new reflection, and I'm delighted because it's certainly something that the sector itself has been banging on about for a long time, in the sense that, you know, we've got this massive cohort of people who are employed in the sector. The provision of great social care obviously enables many people to work who wouldn't be able to otherwise, either themselves who receive care or they're carers for somebody else. You know, there's huge knock-on. There's a big supply chain element attached to it. There's all sorts of really fantastic contributions that great social care makes within communities. So I think it's really exciting that there is an understanding about that. I think that you know, what we should be now thinking about is what would we like that to mean in practice? So these are great words to say, but what are we hoping will follow through with that? So we mentioned a bit about employment and skills earlier, and I think there's lots of work to be done around apprenticeships and making them much more appropriate and usable for social care providers to be able to deliver within settings. So that's certainly something that can be in there. But there is also many other things and areas where social care can contribute. Now, we've got thousands and thousands of care homes across the country, extra care housing, supported living, all of which are in accommodation, you know, much of which could have, you know, could be supported to offer more green solutions, could become much more energy efficient. We have somewhere around 500,000 care workers driving around in cars that we could be looking to think about how we transfer that into a focused electric fleet of provision. We've got lots of people who will use public transport, and can we incentivize them to do that in a more effective way, to look at something equivalent to a kind of forces card or something like that encourages people. So there's lots of, I think if we start to see the social care workforce and social care providers as a delivery of economic value to communities, I think that's, you know, that's really helpful. And we started, you know, I think you sometimes think you've been talking about all this for too long, because we almost had captured that probably about, I don't know, 10 or 12 years ago, where we suddenly began to recognize you pay people more, they spend, particularly care workers, they spend it in their local communities as well. So the knock-on ripple impact of that is huge. So I think that's one sort of side of it.
Thank you. Perhaps Martin, you could come in and talk about how that might be realized, how that might be achieved at a local level.
Yeah, no, sure. There's a couple of points I'd probably emphasize here. Is one thing that I think I'd like as part of this, when you talk about solutions, to think about making sure that government are considering care provision and housing for older people in the sort of context of being part of community still, because I think there is a risk the solutions that come forward provide a sort of technical, clinical solution and not a solution that actually means that people still get to take an active part in life in a community outside of their home. So I think for us at Belong, but I'd also ask some of the government to be thinking about how that doesn't happen and people sort of part of communities. But I suppose a more practical thing that is a challenge is that if you look across the sector for the last 15, 20 years, there have been, if you like, new facilities built, but pretty much exclusively because of the funding situation, they have been focused on private pay and hence in more affluent areas of the country. So I think that one of the challenges of the government is how they can facilitate growth, and actually new care facilities are desperately needed. Loads of the facilities around the country are not really fit for purpose for great outcomes for people now. So there needs to be a big building program, which obviously is a stimulant of economic growth in itself before you even look at the sort of workforce point. But how do you facilitate that and stimulate that in the areas that are needed most, which are not in the private pay market as much as the public market, and also in those areas of the country that haven't had as much funding? It'd be interesting from Melanie's perspective as well, because obviously from if you like, some of the metrics on this and the sort of raising money from council tax, again, that suits the more affluent areas of the country. And how can we, if you like, make sure that the other areas don't miss out would be one of the sort of practical considerations.
Yeah, absolutely. Melanie, apologies, you had your hand up as well.
No, that's okay. So yeah, so I think Vic touched on this. So we do employ 5% of the labour market in adult social care, and that's not recognised. So there is something very much about inclusive growth. So inclusive growth to me would include gender equality. So women are entitled to economic growth as well as men, and it's a predominantly female workforce. So I think, you know, tackling those pay issues that we've all touched on in the last hour, I think would be really important for that local inclusive growth. And then Martin touched on the capital issue. So we have had no capital to invest locally or nationally, and the homes programme has been quite stifled and very directional. It's been very narrow in its view. So I think there's a real opportunity there to be thinking more creatively about that with the new government. And I also think about some of the digital and technology opportunities. So there's lots of new providers really chomping at the bit, and there's lots of providers who don't know how to, you know, make the most of it or invest in it. And local government really is behind the curve on digital and technology. It doesn't really know what to do with it. So I think with some national support and direction of frameworks, we can really start to, you know, think about, you know, growth in that bit of it. And then yes, I agree with Vic. There's something about West Streeting's commitment to be looking at primary community care. I mean, I really was hoping you'd add on social care within that, but there is a bit of that opportunity for the shift, and I think that's where some potential growth has come. So I was thinking about good preventative care for people that they direct, where we can really think about providing support for people without them going into institutions, so whether that's a hospital or whether it's a learning disability assessment facility or a mental health unit. If we're thinking about boosting some of that, because it keeps people at home, keeps people local, and it's a much better way of investing. So for me, that's where some of that opportunity comes from. It's by thinking about that preventative care. And like I say, some of that digital investment and capital money would be really, I think, well spent within the sector.
Thank you. Thank you, Melanie. In that conversation, we touched upon how essential it is now for government to engage with the sector to realise its economic ambitions. What might that look like? How will the government be best placed to engage with the sector? Could care providers be proactive and put themselves forward to in an advisory capacity? What sort of communicative channels would be best established to realise government's economic agenda?
I mean, I think there's lots of it already going on. I suppose it's about how it gets kind of counted and recognised. So obviously we've talked about the workforce strategy, has some of that in there. There's more detailed reform, you know, a more detailed paper which just focuses on economic contribution that's been sort of updated and previously demonstrated that economic contribution. I mean, so I think there are a number of places. So I don't think you should be having local skills partnerships without social care provider representation on board. As Mel said, you know, it's 5% of the overall population, and in many places it's bigger than that, depending on what else is there in the context of industry or in those localities, or need in those localities. So you shouldn't be able to have one of those type of skills and employment boards without some social care provision on there. Clearly, of course, yes, there's opportunities to represent care providers on broader industrial strategies. I mean, we are a very significant industry. There's lots of you know, in the context of whether you measure it in assets or in people or in, you know, in overall. There's obviously the amount that comes through the public sector funding, but then many people pay huge amounts of money of their own into the sector. So you know, I just think sort of recognizing it as a kind of grown up and having a place at the table would be an important way forward. But then I think it is more about kind of setting out a clear plan, because right now people are making decisions about where people, you know, providers are thinking about where they might want to develop services based on people like Mel's plans, but also on factors about whether they think that they will have sufficient people who want to pay for their own care in that context. So we're not thinking about the development of care, strikes me, in a very planned way that will then sort of either share out the economic benefit or strengthen the economic benefit. We've got lots of situations, and, you know, Mel, you might want to comment on this, but, you know, where there may well be existing care provision in a locality, and then new care provision comes in, and you know, that could be home care or residential care, and essentially all it does is make the market, which I hate that term, but make the number of people who receive care and support spread between two providers, and making neither of them viable in that context. Because so that doesn't help anybody in that sense. There's huge amounts of wasted investment there. There's massive inefficiency. So, you know, there may well be things that we can think about from the planning context. And I don't just mean sort of geographic planning, but planning about how services are, laying out really clear 10-year economic plans or industrial plans that enable providers to make sensible decisions, and I think will enable capital through banks and or through public funding and a homes program or something like that to flow. Without that, at the moment, it's quite difficult for departments or you know, public sector investment to prioritize investing into the sector.
Thank you, Melanie.
Yeah, that market shaping piece is really important. So we struggle to do that even on a local authority footprint, and certainly nationally we don't have care in the right places. So you know, in where I am at County Hall in Nottinghamshire, right across the road is an extra care facility being built, and in Rushcliffe it's very difficult for people to be able to afford to fund their own care, and certainly we have a shortage of people who are at the local authority rate, and this is being completely pitched at self-funders. We've got no evidence that there's a market for it. So I think Viv's point about how do we start to get the investment where it's needed and the right sort of care, because as new providers come in that have got lots and lots of capacity, all that does is then sort of share out the workforce, which is very scant in a way that isn't helpful for provider resilience. So I think how do we apply a sort of market shaping piece across the landscape is going to be really important, because we know, don't we, from Chris Whitty's report, and I mentioned it earlier about this area, and the older people are going to be in the coastal regions, and people willing to work are going to be in the cities. So it's how do we start to mirror up some of those trends and patterns really helpful way will be quite important for that.
Thank you. And Martin.
Yeah, I know it's a really obvious point, and I'm going to say it particularly because Isaac's not here as well, but I think it's really important that we make sure that the voices of the people that receive support and their families and loved ones are really also considered carefully. And I think, there are various examples I can think of where it's done probably quite well at the outset before something's done, but then there's an iterative process about the solution. There's going to be lots of ideas floating around. And say if you go back to the rollout of the single assessment framework, that CQC put a lot of effort into thinking about how and engaging with people at the start, but I'm not sure the solution they've ended up with would have been anything like what it is had they had more involvement along the lines when they looked at the sort of solutions and how they were going to roll it out. So I definitely think the people that receive support and families, and it's not easy, is it, clearly? So it needs to be given some considerable thought about how they might actually genuinely do that as we talk through ideas and solutions. So that needs to be given considerable. And going back to your point as well, I think the reality is the care sector is really fragmented, and there's a huge amount of smaller providers. So there is all of us have to accept there's an element of, obviously great organisations like the NCF are representing our views, and if we want our voices heard over and above that, we're going to have to make a considerable effort ourselves to put ourselves forward and try and engage with the process and be proactive about that.
I think unless anyone has some additional reflections on anything that we've discussed today, go on, Melanie.
I'm just quite mindful we haven't touched upon unpaid carers. No, I think one of the areas where we are underdeveloped is thinking about our solutions to support people to care. And so I think that's one of the opportunities. And one of the things I'm really optimistic for government to start to reform. I mean, it is about how do we do that? And I think Martin just triggered some of that thoughts because we know that we need to be thinking differently about how we provide care and support, how we connect people, how we build community. And there's a real role, I think, for providers enabling that to happen. So we often think of the person, don't we? And that's where the effort is at the moment. I think as part of that broader approach, that support to unpaid carers and keeping families and relationships together, I think it's going to need to be a real focus for us.
Yep, absolutely. And Vic?
I was just going to go back to the global side of things.
Certainly.
Because I currently chair the Global Aging Network, and I think that is a great opportunity to kind of pick up on some of those opportunities to share good practice and to connect together with people who have tackled some of the agendas that we will need to be thinking about moving forward. For example, we're just doing some work thinking about assisted dying. For example, there's plenty of places around the world who have started to, either implement legislation around that or exploring those issues. It's not something that we have got legislation on here in the UK, but it's actively been discussed in the House of Commons and in other areas. So that will, if that is something that comes forward, that will have an impact on social care. So we should be exploring what that means in practice. We also have to think about and recognise not just other opportunities, but there are also challenges around that. And actually what we have now is a global care workforce, global health and care workforce. And so some parts of the world, I saw in the recent readout from NMC the other day that large chunks of our growth in nurses, for example, have come from India. Well, we also know that India's aging population is going to grow at a rate that will overtake all of our countries in the next 5 to 10 years. So actually the ability of countries like the UK, Canada, Australia and others to recruit nurses from India and from other parts of sub-Saharan Africa and things will be significantly reduced because they will very rightly be dealing with health and care situations in their countries alongside China and other places where there isn't the same sort of level of working age population. So, but facing up to those things and talking about what the solution to them means in practice is a really important role. And I think we need to do more of that in partnership with local government and in partnership with health colleagues. But until we get a government properly grasping the fact that we don't operate in glorious isolation in either the care or health sector, I think we're going to really struggle to identify the solutions that will future-proof care for people who need it. And I think Mel's point about unpaid carers is absolutely huge, because we know that hundreds of people take on caring responsibilities for the first time each and every day. So the Health Watch report came out yesterday that was talking about another 1.5 million people it identifies who can't currently access care and support when they need it. They will all be in family situations where they're under enormous pressure. And Martin, and colleagues from across NCF who I talk to on a regular basis are saying that now when people are coming in to care, whether it's home care or residential care, they themselves are in a significant point of crisis, but so are their families, because they have waited either because they couldn't access it through an assessment process, or they were waiting till the last moment because they knew they were going to have to pay for it themselves. And the strain on those families is enormous, and therefore the ability of those families to, whether it's by respite or to take on more kind of care going forward is really diminished. And that's not a situation we want anyone to be in. So we have, we've got this amazing cohort of people who provide millions and millions of hours of unpaid care every day for people that they love, but also for their friends and neighbours and all sorts of other people within their communities. And unless we're very careful, we're going to burn them out to the point that they themselves are incredibly become unwell and need care.
Does anyone else have any final comments before we wrap up today's episode? No, that's absolutely fine. So a huge thank you to our guests, Melanie Williams, Martin Ricks, Isaac Samuels, and a special thanks to my co-host, Vic Rayner. This episode of CMM Off the Page has discussed what the general election outcome means for social care. To catch up on all previous episodes and for even more social care content, visit the CMM website. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you for tuning in to CMM Off the Page. Explore CMM's portfolio of content, including daily news, blogs, a magazine, and CMM Insight webinars by visiting www.caremanagementmatters.co.uk. To make sure you don't miss a podcast, follow CMM on Twitter @CMM_magazine and use the hashtag CMMOffThePage to join the conversation and share your feedback. See you next time. CMM Off the Page. Listen, learn, lead.